My name is Josh Cohen. I'm a psychoanalyst in private practice here in London and professor of modern literary theory at Goldsmiths, University of London. Welcome to my exp. Psychoanalysis is interested in anger from very early on. And in fact, it's right at, it's sort of in there on the ground floor of psychoanalysis, if you like, because one of the first sort of programmatic statements of psychoanalytic thinking comes in 1893 when Freud, with his collaborator Joseph Breuer, who was a general physician in Vienna, an older man, but they collaborated on a series of experiments in psychotherapy which would give rise to what we call psychoanalysis. And in 1893, so very early, they write what they call a preliminary communication about their findings. And they have an idea that the traumas that trouble our mental lives are caused by injuries. That is, by psychic injuries, by psychic foreign bodies that kind of intrude. And often what this leads to is a kind of lodged anger at the center of the self. One of the examples they give is of an employee, a man who has been humiliated in the street by his boss, who has attacked him with a stick. And this man finds himself unable, for whatever reason, to retaliate or to remonstrate with his boss. And so he has to silently swallow his humiliation. And Freud very briefly gives us this case, but he says that under hypnosis, this man reproduces a second scene in which he goes to court against this boss and actually fails to get satisfaction. And so the humiliation is doubled. So we're dealing with a traumatized man in whom a feeling of humiliation has sort of entrenched itself. And this particular sense of injury, a kind of injury to the dignity of the human being at the very core, a kind of violation at the most raw and vulnerable place. This is the source of anger. The pair of them, I think, make what they will acknowledge, or what Freud will acknowledge, as a kind of therapeutic mistake. They come up with a theory of catharsis. They call it abreaction. In other words, if you get into the therapy room and you do the verbal equivalent of punching a cushion, right? You shout and scream and you give vent to all of the frustrations and the feelings of rage that you're experiencing. If you do that for long enough and thoroughly enough, you will cleanse yourself of your anger and you will come out there, sort of internally cleansed. What they actually discover, what Freud discovers down the line, is that it doesn't really work as simply as that. There is something about the feeling of humiliation that will not allow itself to be discharged in this way. The humiliation from the man comes from the sense that his male status and authority and dignity has been fatally compromised in the eyes of the world, so it induces a kind of shame. He doesn't expect to be treated in this way. I think what the Me Too movement has shown us about women's anger is, in a way that I think we both knew and somehow refused to be aware of for so many decades and for so many centuries, is that sort of special and traumatic experience of the man attacked by his boss was the daily, ordinary experience that was being swallowed by women across the world all the time on a daily basis. And I think there's a lot to learn from the way that psychoanalysis talks about the potential bottomlessness, the diffuseness of this kind of anger, the fact that you can't get rid of it by shouting or by somebody apologizing to you, that it induces over the long term a kind of injury that would require a much more thoughtful and comprehensive kind of address than any sticking plaster, than any discrete single action could possibly provide.